Hi, so I made a bunch of videos about conditional statements, and I recall, or I thought of during one of them, that there's sort of a key element here that I think would be worth noting and spending a little bit of time on in its own short little video, which I am attempting to make right now. And I'm trying to be perky because I'm really inside. I feel like lying down and taking a nap. Okay, so what is the topic of this video? And what I want to talk about is, what if you had a variable, and instead of assigning the value of that variable to, say, a number, or perhaps a string, or perhaps an image — these are some things that you may or may not have seen so far — what if the value of that variable, I'm going to call it like going, were equal to true itself or false? So in fact, this is a data type. Now, as you know, anytime you declare a variable, you just say var and the name of the variable, and then it's up to you to assign it a value. Most of the examples we've seen so far, we give those variables numbers. Numbers are useful. They can be used to specify coordinates on the screen, sizes of shapes, colors, red components of a color, the transparency of a color. Numbers generally are being used over and over again everywhere in the code. However, it can be useful to have your own variable that is either set to true or false. Now, before I get to that, one of the reasons why I'm mentioning this to you is there also happens to be a variable built into P5, right? There are the variables built into P5 that you likely know about, mouseX and mousey. These variables are numbers. They hold the coordinate as to where the mouse is on the screen, but there is also a variable called mouseIsPressed. And this particular variable is, its data type is Boolean, meaning it's either true or false. So this is relevant because, why is this relevant? This is relevant because sometimes you want to know, is the mouse being pressed or is it not? Now, earlier in a previous video, at some point in some life where I made this other video, there happened to be a function called mousePressed. And I stated at the time that this function is an event, meaning the code that you write inside this function gets executed instantly the moment the mouse is pressed. So why is there a mousePressed event, but also a Boolean variable to check whether the mouse is pressed or not? And the distinction comes down to the following, and this is a really key distinction which is totally built into the way that you live your life and use a computer, but you may not have thought about it in such detail because it's kind of like just sort of like inherent way of being. But there's a difference between clicking the mouse. I want to click the mouse to instigate something versus I want to hold down the mouse to have something happen continuously while I'm holding down the mouse. And in essence, the Boolean variable is something you want to use when you want to test if the mouse is being held down. And the function mousePressed is the function you want to use when the mouse, for the event, the moment is the mouse is being clicked. All the stuff that happens after that, is it being held down? There's also a mouse released function for knowing when it's released, but I digress. So let's look at the distinction between these two. And I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to do this, but I'm going to go back to the example, the rollover example, and see if we can kind of play around with this idea of it as a button versus a rollover. Whew. Okay, so let's review this example. Since the last time you saw this example, because in my fantasy world, people are just watching these videos one after another in sequence, which I don't know if it's true. I don't know if anybody's watching. I'm doing this anyway. You don't have to watch. It's just something I do to entertain myself during my day. And so I'm going to hit run this, and you can see I did a couple things. One is I used this function rect mode. So now the rectangle is being drawn according to its center. And then I adjusted the coordinates and I added the y coordinate. So this if statement has become very long. I'm checking if mouse X is between the left and right hand side of the rectangle, between the top and bottom. So you can see this works perfectly now. It only changes color if the mouse is anywhere within that rectangle. So we've got a rollover. Now what if I wanted to, when you're inside the circle, do something when the mouse is pressed. Sorry. Okay, I know what I'm doing here. So let's look at that if mouse is pressed variable. So I'm going to actually add just a completely separate if statement. And I'm going to say if mouse is pressed, background. And I think I want to put this, I want to put this above that one. Just actually, it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to put it up here just to kind of for a second, just to kind of keep it all together. So look, I've added another if statement. Sorry, I lost my train of thought here, but everything will come back. So if the mouse is pressed, change the background. So remember, this is different than I click the mouse and one thing happens at the event. Now I'm checking this is the mouse pressed in draw. So what I'm trying to do here is check, is the user holding down the mouse? This is how this is used. Okay? So now, if I click the mouse, I'm holding it down. You can't see here. Watch this. This is going to be a really crazy moment for you. This is my computer rising in this like mechanical desk thing. This doesn't really help, but just showing you that there's a computer here. I'm going to now hold down the mouse. It is green. I am now letting go. It is not green. So I have this interaction, which is different than I click the mouse and it's green forever. We're going to have to sort of see how to do that. The other thing what I want to do is only actually have this happen when I'm on, if I'm on this rollover. So let's figure that out. So it's kind of silly, but the way I'm going to do it right now is take this if statement, and put it inside this if statement. Now, I probably could figure out a way of joining this with another and, but what I'm saying here is look at this. Look at this. This is kind of exciting and different. If the mouse, let me put this back down. If the mouse is within that rectangle and it's pressed, change the background. But it doesn't matter whether it's pressed or not. If it's within that rectangle, always change the highlight. So we can see the logic here that I now have. It's always going to, I always have this rollover. It's going to get highlighted as soon as the mouse is over there. I could click anywhere around, it doesn't change color, but now when I click here, but only when I'm holding it down. Okay? So now, that's using the if mouse is pressed. What if I wanted this? This is like a button that you hold down. It's like if you had a light at home, and in order to have the light on, you just always had to hold down the button, the switch. As soon as you left, it like turned off. So with your light at home, you want to press it, it goes on, you leave, you can come back later, you could press it again. Now, for this to happen, we need an entire other kind of, we need another variable, okay? And we need to use the mouse pressed event. So we're going to piece these things together. So now we have a rollover where you hold down, how many? 7 minutes. You hold down the mouse, it turns the light on. What I want to do is press the button, turn the light on, press the button, turn the light off. This is kind of like, strangely, such a simple thing. It's a bit of a tricky interaction problem, a tricky programming logic, something like that problem. But let's figure it out. Okay, so ultimately, what I want now is to have my own, the way to do this is not to use the mouse is pressed variable. That has a value that's just built into the operating system, into P5, into JavaScript, into the browser. It knows whether the mouse is pressed or not. I want to have my own variable. I want to have a variable and call it on. There might be an issue with using this term on, but for now I think it's going to be okay. And I'm going to start with on equal to false. So when the program first runs, the light is off. When on is false, the light is off. And in draw, what I essentially want to do is I want to say if on, then set the background to some other color. Otherwise, set the background to some other color. So this is the idea here. If I have my own Boolean variable that's either false or true, I can just change the value of that variable somewhere else in the code. When I click the mouse, turn this to true, and the light will always be on. Then I have to figure out when do I set it back equal to false. So let's take a look at doing this with this. Now, in theory, I should upload all of these code examples somewhere, and I got to figure out a way to do that. But at the very least, what I'm going to do is save project as conditionals button, and hopefully that previous one will be saved. So I'm gonna take some of this code for a second and just stick it at the bottom and put it in comments, because I might need to refer to it later. So down here, we might need to get back this rollover code, and maybe we need to look at the if mouse is pressed thing again. But right now, instead, what I want to do is just add at the top var on equals false. And here, I want to say if on background, a green background, otherwise a black background. So let's look at that. This is just a simple if statement. If on, otherwise background. Now, there's actually, like, I can't believe I didn't even mention this really, because we looked at this with mousePressed, and we looked at this with on. It's just sort of intuitive to me. But always before, when you had a Boolean expression, you needed to have some sort of like relational operator, like if mouse x is greater than 100. Here I just said that the whole point of this is this evaluates to true or false. That's sort of off the edge, or there's a bit of glare there. But this evaluates to true or false. A variable with type Boolean, you don't need to check anything about it. It itself just has the value true or false. It evaluates to true or false. That's its whole purpose in life. You could technically say this. You could say if on equals true, and this would be the same thing, like if on has the value true, but this is redundant. So this might actually help you to sort of think about it, because this is really what's going on. But code-wise, it's a little bit shorter to just write if on and then open curly bracket. Okay? So now I'm coming back over here, and we see that now. If on, green, otherwise black. So I'm going to run this. You can see there's no green because on is set to false, and I'm not setting it to true anywhere. Now, if on is set to true, I'm going to hard code that. Now, the background is green because on is true, so this code is being executed. So now, the difference between wanting to do something when the mouse is held down versus instigated event the moment the mouse is clicked is I need to add function mousePressed. So instead of before, remember with the holding down the mouse, I had this if mousePressed in draw. Now I want to have this event. And what I can't do, I don't want to put draw the green background here, right? Remember, draw is always looping. So drawing code here in this case doesn't really make sense because it will just get overwritten by what happens in draw. What I want to do is change the state of the program. How do I change the state of the program? Well, on starts as false, that's its initial value. And when I run the program, it's false, it's black. What I want to do is say, when I click the mouse, set on equal to true, or on equals true. So now, on equals true. Let's click the mouse. Ta-da! It's on. Click the mouse again. It didn't turn off. Also, when I run this again, I can click out here. It turns to on. So how do I get it only to turn to on if I'm within the bounds of that rectangle? Well, that's an easy thing. That's why I saved this code. We can now, inside mousePressed, test for, we can test for the location. So the thing that I've added right here is now, when the mouse is pressed, first check to see where the mouse is, and only if it's within that rectangle, set it equal to on. So let's run this again. Okay, I'm clicking all around the outside, nothing's happening. Now I'm going to click in the center, here it comes. It turns on. Now I want it to turn off. So this is a tricky one. If it's on, if it's true, it should go off. Otherwise, if it's off, it should become on. I already confused myself. We want it to toggle its state. True becomes false, false becomes true. True becomes false, false becomes true. And I could actually type this out. I could diagram this for you, but I'm just going to kind of type it out. I'm going to say, if on is true, on should be false. Otherwise, on should be true. Now this is kind of like, oh, the camera shut off here. I'm turning it back on. So this is definitely is like a point of confusion. No, the camera turned off. I don't need to go over there anymore. This is definitely a point of confusion. It's tricky. Like, sort of like very circular, weird logic. But think about it. If it's on, turn it off. Otherwise, it must have been off, so turn it on. So let's see if that works. Yay! So now I have this button. Every time I press it, I change the state of the program. Pretty exciting. Now, this, however, can be condensed all into one line of code, and it involves an operator that this is perfect because I was like, what operator did I forget? The not operator is something that I forgot. So I do need to come over here, so I need to turn this camera back on. So I want to look here at the not operator. So we know that I could say something like if mouse x is greater than 100, do something. And I could invert this, like the opposite of it's greater than 100 would be kind of like less than or equal to 100. But I can also say if it's not true that it's greater than 100, do something. And the not operator is an exclamation point. So for example, if not on, what does this mean? Do something. So I have a variable on, it's equal to false. Does this code get executed? Yes or no? Not false is true. So this expression together evaluates to true. Therefore, this code does get evaluated. So let me make another statement to you. And this is like, this is like very uncomfortable here. We're going to do it. On equals not on. What does that mean? I want to set the value of this variable to not itself. So if its value is false, not false is true. If its value is true, not true is false. So this, much like we had that expression speed equals speed times -1, this reversed the polarity of a number. 3 becomes -3, -3 becomes 3. Take a number, multiply by -1, makes a negative positive, a positive negative. This expression takes a Boolean value, makes false true or true false. So if I come back over here and look at this, I could take all of this right here, which has this effect of toggling the Boolean variable, and I could just change it to one line of code, equals not on. And I'm going to run this. The light goes on and off. I've got a button. I can click outside and nothing happens. I click inside. Now we lost our little rollover, so I'm going to also add that back in, which is just about highlighting the color. And so we don't need the mousePressed part anymore. Sorry. And so all we're doing here, is I wanted to add in also. So notice, if I want to check is the mouse over it continuously, that's something I need to do in draw. But at the moment the mouse is pressed, I also need to check is the mouse over it for the button. So this now has the functionality of if I'm over it, it's highlighted, but only if I click does that button engage. So I have a couple things to say about this. Number one is anytime you notice two pieces of code in your program that are basically identical, you should ask yourself the question, is there a better way to do this? Now we need to get further down the road here, but maybe there's a way we could create our own function that tested if the mouse is over a given point, and we kind of can do that in two places without copying and pasting the same code. That's something we're going to see later, that I'm going to show you later. The other thing to think about here that's super interesting, again, I think it's a point that I started with, is I just spent, oh my God, this is 20 minutes, this video, crazy enough. 20 minutes just looking at how to make a button to happen, rollover versus a button. And what's interesting about working in P5 and in the browser is later, and as I get to further topics, I would like to show you how you can add buttons and interface elements that you get essentially for free that are part of the native browser environments. They're HTML elements. They're elements that you can add to a web page with a little bit of actually code in P5 will let you just create one, and you can kind of hook different events, and the P5 is going to take care of a lot of this. Is the mouse over it, or did the mouse press it? That type of thing. But I think there's a moment here as you're just starting out programming, working in the raw canvas, that it's worthwhile to try to program some of these button and rollover kind of elements, and it's just good practice and kind of gets you working with all this logic stuff, and it'll be interesting to compare to it later. So I would say if you're trying to think of an exercise or piggyback off of this, is you might have some stuff, putting this kind of button on a sketch where there's something moving around the screen. And when you press the button, can you make the thing move in a different direction or change its size, or what kind of other types of things can you hook into a button like this besides just changing the background color? Okay, hopefully that was useful to you. I am now going to stop this video, and I'm going to move on to making some videos about loops. Stop recording.